Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Wilkes, and I'm the director of the John L.Warfield Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for joining us for Duets, Black Creatives in Conversation, the Warfield series that brings artists to UT Austin for lively exchanges with members of the campus and greater Austin communities. Before continuing, I want to acknowledge that those of us in North America are on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cushada, Caddo, Carrizo Come Crudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. Next, please join me in thanking Warfield Center Senior Programming Coordinator Christina Bryant and Graduate Assistant Alexis Cunningham, who have been the organizational forces behind this event. Thank you, Christina and Alex. Today, I'm delighted to welcome author Asali Solomon. Disgruntled, her first novel, was named a Best Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle and the Denver Post. Get Down, her debut story collection, earned Solomon a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honor. It was also a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Last year brought the release of Solomon's second novel, The Days of Afrekete, which draws inspiration from Audre Lorde's Zemi, Toni Morrison's Sula, and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Solomon teaches fiction writing and literature of the African diaspora at Haverford College. She was born and raised in Philadelphia, where she lives with her husband and 2 sons. Joining Solomon in conversation is Mia Carter, Associate Dean for Student Affairs in UT's College of Liberal Arts. Carter is also Associate Professor and University Distinguished Teaching Associate Professor in the English Department, as well as a 2010 University of Texas System Regents Outstanding Teacher Award recipient. And Carter is also the inaugural coordinator of UT Austin's implementation of the Mellon Foundation's Engaged Scholar Initiative. And in continuing in the but wait, there's more fashion of today's guest, Carter is also an incisive scholar of modernist studies, post-colonial literatures, and film. All of this to say, we are definitely in for a treat. Our featured conversation will be followed by an open Q&A, and you can use the handy chat box on the lower right side of your screen to pose your questions. Please join me in welcoming Asali Solomon and Mia Carter to the virtual stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
When we were sitting in the waiting room, setting up Asali, I was confessing that I read Get Down over the weekend, and that I have a whole mixtape trapped in my head, and that I was stuck on Kool and the Gang's Jungle Boogie, and so I love that collection, and I'm really looking forward to talking about the Days of Afrekete with you. I will do a really short and succinct introduction of the main cast of characters, and then I have a series of questions for you, and will love to hear from the audience, and particularly from people who've read the wonderful novel. So for those of you who may not know the cast of characters, main character, Lizelle Belmont, is 41 years old. She is a gracious hostess who is out shopping for cheese and flowers. Very nice kind of echoes of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Her husband, Wynn Anderson, this is one of my favorite descriptions of Wynn, that he is a white politician who may have been involved in some political and shenanigans. He had the look of someone who had aged out of playing the rich jerk in an 80s teen movie. I see Rob Lowish sleaziness. we have the son of Wynne and Lizelle, Patrice, her mother, who is one of my favorite literary mothers right now, Verity Belmont, who's is a very powerful and salty truth teller. The maid, Jimena, and her daughter, Xochitl, whom are there in interesting ways. I'm absolutely fascinated with the generational differences of Xochitl and Patrice, who are just watchers. They like see everything and see through everything. And the other main central character is Selena Octave, who has a wonderfully sensual and rich name, and is Lizelle's friend, who she met in her senior year at Bryn Mawr College. And I'm going to read a really short scene in which Lizelle and Selena are meeting for the first time. And they're meeting in a class, a literature class, and let me get my page, that is taught by an African-American literature professor at Bryn Mawr. The class is called Writing Away from No Way. When we first meet Lizelle in this past glimpse, she is pretending that she's read Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, and this woman walks into the class. Says, tittering erupted, and it struck Lizelle that she and the professor were the only two Black women there. Didn't other Black girls at Bryn Mawr want to read books by Black women? As if on cue, the classroom door burst open. The arriving girl was, Lizelle could see without even turning her head, Black, and wearing something skimpy and bright yellow, all wrong for showing up late. Lizelle felt her cheeks warm as the girl clacked forward in what sounded like platform shoes. As the class continued to casually demonstrate their erudite and wide-ranging tastes, Lizelle began to feel that she might very well hate, if not this professor, then her fawning white familiars. Though the names on the syllabus thrilled her, Entezaki Sanjay, Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Angela Davis, Lucille Clifton, Jane Cortez, an unfamiliar lovely name, she reflected that on the first day of class, it was permissible to get up and quietly leave. She would give her seat to the girl standing near the door in her ridiculous dress. Miss, said the professor, before you arrived, we were introducing ourselves and sharing the title of something we enjoyed reading recently. Selena Octave had recently enjoyed reading The Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Souljah. The class looked to the clearly bemused professor for guidance. Verity hated that book, but it had made a strong impression on Lizelle, especially some parts. Lizelle looked at Selena, her short, ropey dreadlocks, lips like Lauryn Hill's. Remembering that The Coldest Winter Ever had given Lizelle what Kit called a girl boner, she forgot to get up and leave the class. She couldn't stop staring at Selena. One more central character is Afrekete herself, and Afrekete from the Yoruba spirits, a mythological figure who is really important to Audre Lorde and her corpus. Two quick frames of Audre Lorde's Zami. In the introduction, there's a tribute to which Lorde writes, to the journey woman, all one word, pieces of myself, becoming, period, Afrekete, period. And in the epilogue to Zami, Lorde writes, recreating in words the women who helped give me substance, Ma Lise, Delois, Louise Briscoe, Aunt Annie, Linda, and Genevieve, Maulisa, thunder, sky, sun, the great mother of us all, and Afrekete, her youngest daughter, the mischievous linguist, trickster, best beloved, whom we must all become. The frame of the Days of Afrekete give us, we're introduced to Lizelle in the present, but we get to know her best, or we get to feel her best in these past glimpses of her love, sensual, dangerous relationship with Selena at Bryn Mawr when they were young. I think this novel is filled with so much thickness, along with delight. There's colorism and class, memory and desire, sexuality as an unscripted terrain, the terrors and thrills and dangers of young adulthood with all of its awkwardness and adventure and outsized passions. What were you hoping that readers would be willing to look at or discover or think about via Liesel's life story and her conflicting selves? I mean, some of the first images that we get of her in her present day life, married to Wynne, a white upper middle class man. She has this fantastic glimpse of herself when she's thinking about Jimena, the maid, and Xochitl, her daughter. And I love this. I love the way that you create these pictures that you just cannot get out of your head. And she's wondering if anyone in the household has been involved with the disclosure of Wynne's hanky-panky political goings on, and Liesel has this image of herself. She's and the narrative section reads, Liesel could not decide which one, whether or not Xochitl was going to be a rescuer or a betrayer. It says the fantasy that Xochitl would comfort her, or the fantasy of betrayal, made her feel more like she was wearing a hoop skirt and waving a lace fan at Xochitl across a gulf from the wrong side of history. So we get these, this contradiction of Liesel's selves. What were you hoping your readers would be able to understand about this bougie, compromised person that Liesel is in her present life, and these wonderfully rich glimpses that we get of her as a young woman, as a kind of daring explorer, and as a lover of many women? She's seen as kind of wolfishly voracious. So what were you hoping your readers would think about, look at, discover through Liesel's doubled self?
Yeah, so I rarely, in terms of like having an idea or writing, I'm thinking about it from that perspective. Like, the thing I'm trying to do is create scenes and characters that people find very absorbing, because I'm interested in working on a project. And so one of the things about this book is that it was part of the idea from it came from something rather random, which was that I was reading about the First Lady of New York, Charlene McRae. And once upon a time, she was a member of the Combahee River Collective, and she was a lesbian poet. And I just thought that was like kind of fascinating. And I was like, what? And it's not that I'm that interested in Bill de Blasio or Charlene McRae, but it was like, I learned this at a time when I felt like a lot of women my age were sort of, and Black women sort of moving around in terms of their sexual identity in ways that were not, they weren't making announcements, they weren't apologizing. It was just like, oh, I'm queer, but now I'm with this, with this. And so Liesel is not exactly like that, because she's a little more calculated in terms of her trajectory. But I was sort of interested in that. I was also interested in the way that people move in terms of class and middle age, and how I think you said bougie and compromise. And I think that those two things are not at all a contradiction. They often run together, and definitely for a lot of Black people my age who are sort of solidly middle class or wealthier than that, like they're living a life that was very different than the lives that their parents lived in a lot of ways. And what do those accommodations look like, and what do those shifts look like, was something that was really interesting to me. But I think a lot of what I do as a writer is notice things in life that I haven't really encountered in fiction, and try to like think through them and try to like sort of bring something else into books. So just these sort of these like moments at this dinner party or certain kinds of interactions between people. Definitely like the idea, a lot of people, there's a different kind of thing when we talk about housekeepers in a lot of places now in terms of the demographics, housekeepers, nannies, et cetera, et cetera. It's not the old sort of black, white. And so I was interested in that too. I was interested in also making Xochitl the kind of character who like, you can see her in the book, but you can imagine if she walked off and had her own story, what it might be like. So those are some of the things I was thinking about.
I love the way that Xochitl and Patrice, who I thought of Patrice Lumumba when I first thought that Patrice was a female, and then there's a quick reference to her son, and I thought they are just this generation kind of observing the present, but seeing through so many levels of things, but we don't get their story. We don't get their. I wanted the sequel, well, by the time I was like, I really wonder what Patrice is making of all this mess. Selena is an interesting character in that there's so much intertextuality in this book. It's one of the things that I loved about it, and I'm a notorious cataloger, and my catalog of the intertextual references and the literary references and the musical references and the television references, there is a really rich commentary about culture that I would hope that we get to talk about. But Selena is introduced as I read her as kind of mystical and spirit connected. In one scene in the novel, when Afrekete comes up from Selena, and in a conversation with Selena and Lizelle, Selena bodily kind of responds to Afrekete's name, and she says, "Afrekete, that's a good name." And she leaves the African American literature class with all those women and women writers, and takes a class on the Romantic poets and Walden. And so how does is Selena a kind of mystical character in some ways? That I don't know, might be a ridiculous question, but she's so empathetically connected to different times and different bodies. She sometimes, when I was reading her character, she seems both kind of spiritual and neurodivergent. I mean, she feels other people's pain. If she's reading about the Native Americans, about Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, about the Philadelphia, the families of Move, like there's something that for Lizelle, their words and their history or their incidents in the newspaper, but for Selena, there's something so much deeper that she experiences psychically, bodily. How did you connect or see Selena connecting to some of the literatures that like she is pulled toward, or the cultures that seem to offer her moments of respite from the barrage of just like, she feels reality, she feels the past, and the reader sees her substance in a way that we get glimpses of with Lizelle in her past, but it seems to be like the big absence in Lizelle's life is this connection to her own feelings and to pain and other people's feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so she is, I mean, part of what I was interested in there is the fact that like, if you live like that, if you have that level of empathy, it would definitely be coded as mental illness and you would definitely have trouble functioning. And so I think like, it's just interesting to me how much, sort of stepping over, people laying in the street one does in the course of, living in certain kinds of societies, or, reading things, but not really registering them. That's like just a huge part of functioning. And so I was interested in that about her. And I think also, certainly as you were talking about it, I was thinking about Lauren Olamina and Parable of the Sower, right?
Mhm.
The Octavia Butler's novel. I mean, and Lauren Olamina is very different because she's kind of like a leader / warrior, whereas Selena is not, maybe she has the sort of soul of a kind of artist or something like that. And so I was interested in that, and I was interested in like the sort of compliment that they could provide to each other, and also that level of sort of complementarity for them is also kind of destructive, right? Like, it would be too hard for Lizelle to deal with somebody who was really feeling at that level, and too difficult for Selena to deal with somebody like Lizelle, who, has a pretty strong exterior, right, in a lot of ways. And, Afrekete is interesting to me because, like, at the end of Zami, Audre Lorde has an affair with this woman named Afrekete, and she also calls her Kitty. And then at the end, you're like, oh, this is actually a kind of idea of a person, right? Like, this is actually also, so a love affair, but also a way of reconciling with herself, right? And it's almost like she like has this, reconnection or connection with herself as like this queer Black woman. And so I was really interested in that idea. Like and so it's that she's, it's that Selena, she definitely has, I guess you could call it mystical, but I was also thinking about something about the way that together they're sort of greater than the sum of parts.
The power of that, the discovering each other as kind of outsiders together at Bryn Mawr is just beautifully rendered in the book. And part of the pain that you see Lizelle's life has this missing element that is substantial, and that she is not even fully aware of, particularly at the beginning of the novel. You have a very complex kind of humor, and that runs through this book. And some people describe your style as satire, but it's so much more. Not that satire is a lesser genre, I'm not suggesting that at all, but it's this funny, and it stings, and it's light shedding in particular moments. How would you describe your style in this novel? Or what kind of combinations of traditions were you aware of kind of working through?
I mean, it's interesting. I think there is social satire in this, but I don't really think of it as satirical in any significant way. I think that, I don't know that, like, I feel like you've done such a good job, like, talking about these different elements of the novel. Like, I wish I was, like, taking notes on some of the ways you've described these things.
I just love the book. It was just such a huge pleasure to get into their world.
But I do think that the kind of humor that I'm really interested in. I mean, first of all, I'm interested in humor. Like, I feel like if you can make something funny, then you should make something funny. Like, that's just part of your job, delivering something to other human beings, right? But the other part of it is like, a lot of times the joke comes from the sort of gasp, like, like, oh, is that oh, yes, that's funny, because it's sort of a shocking, thing to sort of make a joke about. And a lot of times that kind of humor is also related to the kinds of things that people won't say, but they should say, right? So insights about identity and difference and racism and genocide, just like all of these things that, like, if people actually talked more openly about them, like, like, we might get a lot further. And so a lot of times the humor is that kind of like, let's just go ahead and make this joke as a way of, I mean, I'm into a joke for a joke's sake, but also as a way to think about something. I had a conversation a few months ago with the writer Kiesi Lehman,
Mhm.
who's written a number of books, including Heavy, which is a memoir that's brutally funny and also just brutal, you know. And he was sort of saying that he thought of humor as a way into like different kinds of conversations, right? And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about it, right? Like it's not, so I mean, definitely I'm a clown and there are jokes for jokes' sake, but some of it is like, also you can start talking about something by joking about it. Also, Professor Elizabeth McCracken is on, I see, who's my teacher, and she always told us that humor makes the sad parts of your work sadder, and sadness makes the funny parts funnier. And I always think that those are like important, you know, thinking about compliments that just make the experience richer.
Richer is a good word, or richness. I have to ask you about this and please, audience, just have patience with me. I'm going to recite some of the cultural layers that are in the intercultural, multi-genre, multimedia landscape of this novel. So from Wolf and Audre Lorde, Christina Rossetti, Jonathan Swift, Lauryn Hill, Zora Neale Hurston, Marx's Capital, that whole constellation of African-American women writers that I mentioned in the quotation, the Munsters, Joan Didion, The Snowy Day, that beautiful scene where Selena's remembering the snowy day. Henry Louis Gates, Tupac, Wilt Stillman movies, Waiting to Exhale, Three's Company, Jay-Z and Talking Heads, Working Girl, Sarah Bartman, Bowie's Heroes, Angel Heart in a Different World, The Godfather. I love that description of Robert De Niro as white plus. Like,
I don't remember I said that, but
I love that line. Fela Kuti. So there is a kind of suggested conversation about culture and about popular culture, about the touchstones that people create for themselves with culture. Can you just talk a little bit about this amazing, encyclopedic, groovy, funky set of references that help create the fictional worlds that are such a pleasure of reading you? Like, where does that, how do you even, I don't know, process? I mean, I started cataloging out of sheer pleasure and my own memories, and oh yeah, that song, and the way that you create the atmosphere of the 80s. I'm an old lady, so it really spoke to me. But there also seems to be something there's conversations about popular culture and the, you know, the painfulness of some of the representations that are part of people's identity and what's projected on them. So can you just talk a little bit about and music and film and television and some of the things that really wonderfully kind of make your world dimensional in ways that a huge variety of readers can connect with their own kind of emotional toolkit?
So it's interesting. I think a lot of this stuff is not even, I forgot about half of those things that you mentioned, more than half, right? And I think that it's like almost compulsive. I mean, so I have an almost compulsive sort of tendency to mention music, like songs, like I don't even think about it. And then I think that, but I think what a lot of that is doing, and sometimes, you know, it'll be other things, it'll be clothes or whatever. It's almost like I'm a person who writes about people in cities, namely Philadelphia. And one of the things that's really missing from my writing is like any sort of serious engagement with like trees or natural, like I don't tend to describe, you know, buildings in terms of architecture or, you know, this kind of thing. And I think actually like that stuff is like almost like a physical landscape in, yeah, it's like a landscape in the work. So it's like the trees, or it's like the buildings, you know, in by architectural description, or what kinds of grasses, or this kind of stuff. I mean, it's still my goal to learn all trees and grasses. After I read Richard Powers' The Overstory, I felt really bad for quite some time about my lack of knowledge in these areas. But I think that that's the way that and it's a very, like, doing a lot of that stuff is a really good way to communicate character.
Yeah.
In many ways. And I mean, so much of our identity is like the music we listen to, the music we grew up listening to, the kinds of, you know, things that we read. And I mean, I love just shouting out books or bringing books into the conversation for a lot of, you know, in a lot of different ways. And I also, I mean, in this book, definitely, like, I really enjoyed writing about the kind of posturing people do with books, which is particularly relevant for college students, you know. But it's really, I don't, you know, I went to make a list of all the songs in there to make like a playlist. And I was like, oh, I didn't even remember that this was, you know, it was just a way of creating scenes.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic mixtape. And, you know, I do think that there's you, as someone who lived through the 80s as a young woman, around a little older than these characters. I was in my 20s in the 80s. You do such a great job of bringing that world back with force and color and vibrancy and passion. Epigraphs are something that I find really interesting in your work, and and then we can open up for some questions. There's a line that I would love for you to, the syntax of it is so provocative, and it's the dedication that you have at the beginning of the novel: for every Black woman everywhere. And it's not for Black women everywhere, but for every Black woman everywhere. And I kept rereading that sentence. And then I read Get Down and saw the Jay-Z "This Can't Be Life" epigraph. Disgruntled, I'm saving for spring break, but I loved the Donny Hathaway, young, gifted, and Black, it's where it's at. And Afrekete has another list that it goes from Don't Let Me Be Lonely, James Taylor, Paul Celan, the Isley Brothers, and Claudia Rankine. I want to just mix all that up in a pot for a minute, but can you start for the every Black woman everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was kind of what that I was thinking with the dedication. And I think, like, everywhere just seemed to be more just to make sure that everyone felt like they were included in it. And, you know, thinking about the different kinds of women in this book, and thinking about, like, you know, the different kinds of women who are referred to in this book but are not characters in this book. And just thinking about, I mean, certainly we're not talking about a monolithic set of struggles at all, but there are definitely things that I think you struggle against as a Black woman that every Black woman can talk about in one way or another. And, you know, the book is kind of a love letter in that way. So I think that was part of it as well.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I really like epigraphs, actually. I like coming up with
epigraphs. I love epigraphs. You know, it's like an establishing shot in a movie sometimes, where there's little hints about what might be to come, or I don't know, gives you a flavor of expectation. Do we have questions? Anyone have some questions? How many people have read the Days of Afrekete, or are waiting for the wonderful pleasure ahead? Carrie, do you want to ask a question?
I do. I'm trying to formulate it in the most concise way, but thank you so much for being here. I love your book. I think what I'm wondering about is how time functions in the novel, and if you could just speak to that. I don't even know if I have a specific question, except maybe to say, Like, when did you know that the dinner party might be a good frame for your characters and how to dip into the past and present, right? Or just your experiences with balancing those two. I'd just love to hear anything you have to say about that.
Well, so I basically jacked the structure of the book from Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So I didn't, and it was funny because I can't remember what came first. I think before, so the title of the book was originally American Dinner Party, and I knew it was going to involve a dinner party. And the joke with myself that I had was that dinner parties are really overrepresented in American literature versus how often they actually happen in real life and like real people's real lives. And so I was kind of joke, maybe I'll write a dinner party, call it American Dinner Party. And I don't know, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Dalloway, which is a book I hadn't read in like 18 years or something like that. But I was like, that is a really solid structure. And it's a solid structure because it's about, you know, concentrating on the present moment while also fully not being there, and also learning how somebody arrived at a present moment. And so I thought so that's kind of like how the structure came to be. And in terms of executing it, it was pretty difficult. Like the timeline, and I mean, this is the kind of thing, like, I don't know how I would have done this without copy editors, because it was like, you had to have, like, when do revelations occur? When can you mention something? Oh, wait, we don't really know about that yet, you know? And so moving back and forth, and also having two different characters and all that kind of stuff, it was like a lot of what happened in the book happened in the editing phase, you know, in just terms of like moving things around. And also you're trying to like not simply have revelations for the sake of, you know, when the information happens, but to key it to certain kinds of emotional moments, you know? So yeah, I mean, it was something that I sort of thought of as a good structure, and then worked really hard in the kind of editing stages to try to create in a successful way. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Wolf's Mrs. Dalloway, I think the you know, Mrs. Dalloway's, we see Clarissa when there's a little squeak in the window, and she goes back to the summer of being 18 and being kissed by Sally Seton under the roof of her father's house. And you know, Liesel's initial unlikability evaporates so quickly when we see those glimpses of these two young women being outsiders together at Bryn Mawr, trying to figure their way through the world. It's an excellent device. I would love to see this novel made into a film. And I was thinking about, you know, casting and who could play Liesel with power. And the only character who fully comes to life for me from known actors is Verity, the mother. And, you know, the grandmother on Blackish.
Yes, it's Jennifer Lewis. Okay, it's Jennifer Lewis.
She was so, I kept seeing.
Verity is actually Jennifer Lewis. So there, yeah. She's the only person who, like, I know exactly, like, we know exactly who that is.
She's such a wonderful character, because I could not, for public sake and an audience of young people, read some of her her voice out loud. She is a truth teller who has the kind of that fierce love of that only the fierce love that we know from many mothers, and the many mothers in a community. Like, she sees her daughter and she sees her journey, but she is not going to varnish anything. She's not going to for Liesel. There's a question from Tina. She says, there's something very specific about being a Black woman at a PWI. Is this something that you've experienced personally, or borrowed stories from other women that you know?
Okay, so first, just to mention, I don't know if Mia, you noticed that I took the last line of the book from Mrs. Dalloway.
I did.
Okay.
I didn't want to give it a, I didn't want to give, I was trying to not give any.
Oh, but it's not a spoiler. It's just like,
No,
it's not.
No, it's not a spoiler. It's so
not a spoiler
powerful.
at all. I don't think.
It's so beautiful, and it hangs there in such a haunting way that I didn't want to spoil it for anybody.
So yes, I've been a Black woman at many PWIs, predominantly white institutions. You know, I've been students at many of them. I've been a professor at them. You know, there's a lot of different stuff there that you know, experience, seen, and I think that there's so much. I mean, I the other thing that I thought was like kind of fun to write about in this instance was like something that I hadn't read a lot about was like this phenomena of like Lizelle and Selena. Once they sort of form an alliance, people feel kind of, you know, alarmed by that or jealous or, you know, or like, I thought that was like a sort of interesting dynamic to get involved with. And, you know, I thought I was interested in like creating the particularities of the kind of like predominantly white institution and then the queer community, predominantly white institution in an earlier era. You know, I think there are things that probably would still continue to ring true about that. But I think for them, there's also some kind of claustrophobia there that they're experiencing. So, I mean, there were a lot of nuances and textures of that I was like really interested in writing about.
Yeah, part of the academic world represented in the novels really painfully familiar in ways that seem to be institutionally with us still. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
And Emil, yes, you should write to Netflix directly.
Absolutely.
I have a question, if I may.
You may.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for letting us eavesdrop on your conversation. Asali, I'm wondering, so I have a different question about time, and it's about time of life, because it seems to me that there's also a juxtaposition between the possibilities of youth, and I'm trying to think about the
lesser possibilities of middle age.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. And so I'm wondering if you were also thinking about that as you were writing, and how that factored into Lizelle and Selena's journey back to each other, or what seems to be, you know, bringing them back together.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that part of it has to do just simply with the fact of you get to a certain place in your life and it's time to really start thinking about how you want the rest of it to go. And Lizelle is not really doing that actively, but she's kind of pushed into it by means of this crisis. And, you know, I think she hasn't really been living that, like, in terms of what do I really want or what's authentic, you know, this kind of thing. But I think the other thing that happens is that as you move along, you're sort of like reviewing different parts of your life, you know? And so, you know, yesterday I might have been in like 1994, you know, today maybe I'm in 2001, you know? And so I think that that's also, and you're kind of making up as you go along what happened, right? So some days it's like, well, that was that fateful decision that led to this and this, but then maybe it wasn't, you know? And so I think that process of like re-narrating your life is something that she's actively doing, partially as a result of where she is in her life, you know, partially as a result of being middle-aged, but then also as a result of like this crisis that she's quickly thrown into. Those are always good for making people start to think about what led them to where they are.
How do you see your narrator? When I was reading back to Audre Lorde's mythology of Afrekete and the kind of trickster, the sexually ambiguous figure, the kind of linguist, the the mixer upper of things. Your narrator is familiar and non-judgmental, unsentimental, and kind of amused, like of the community and of the character's world, but almost feels like I've been through this. Like I recognize your journey, and I'm just going to be here witnessing you figuring it out. Do you think much about like the biography of your narrator when you're writing a fiction?
I really don't, but I think that more than anything, these third person narrators, so this and also third person narrator for Disgruntled, are probably derived from reading of 19th century Victorian fiction. Like this kind of slightly so intimate in that the character, they know everything, but there's a kind of like distant, kind of like humorous sense to the way they're sort of narrating a lot of it. In a way that like at times can definitely capture the sort of like deep emotions of the moment, but also at times can capture the sense of a character going through their own melodrama, right? Like, and I do think in a lot of ways that that's like where that voice kind of derives from, for better or for worse. But I haven't really, it's interesting. I thought about the biography of the narrator, not as much. It's a really good question.
I was just picturing this, bemused, sympathetic sister that is kind of watching these younger sisters just trying to find their way through, rooting for them all the time, even while seeing them, their limitations and their missteps.
Well, I mean, people are fools, like essentially, but that doesn't make the things they go through less dramatic or tragic,
Yeah, I think when I was, you have a particular gift for, I'm saving Disgruntled, but I really loved the stories of adolescence in Get Down, and just that world of, I'm thinking of Golden Summer, is that?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The fear, the thrill, the risk of just wanting to be the center of attention, and you write some good geeks, and,
Yeah.
and I have had many moments of like painful recognition of just that, figuring yourself out and hoping that there's someone there who like sees you for you. Yeah. and accepts you, and that's how I feel a lot of your narrators are, like you're there with the characters, and accepting them flaws and mistakes and mess and chaos and confusion, all.
Yeah, I mean, that story is so much, so it's exactly this thing I'm talking about, which is like the drama of self-regard, right? Like this drama that you're starring in your own mind, and like that story, I do have a particular fondness for it. It's just like she almost really gets herself into a terrible situation via, right, like this drama she's starring in her own mind. And I think like it's funny because the thing I'm shocked by, because I've written a lot about young people. Basically, like the first 2 books I wrote were basically just writing about 7th grade. And like, but it's really not that different being a middle-aged person in terms of the drama of self-regard, Yeah. It's very similar. So
as you said that, I was thinking about, and I don't remember the name of this story, but the one with the mother and the son.
The Star of the Story.
Oh, is that,
Yeah.
is that the name of the store? You know, but each of their bodily desires and discomfort and are so powerfully connected to each other, and then the revelation of his sexual coming of age in the story just hits with such a wallop. Let's see, other questions in the scrolling, make sure I'm not missing any. What may I ask what you're working on now?
Oh gosh. You know, I've been
A
talking
question
a
we
little
all
bit about,
hate, but
but
we always
I-
want to know.
yeah, like I feel like, I don't know, sometimes I feel like there are certain phases where the more you talk about it, the more the document erases itself. But basically, you know, more stuff about Philadelphia, more stuff about Black people in Philadelphia, more fiction. So we will see.
Elizabeth McCracken, do you have a question where I see you're sharing your favorite story? The star of the story is Elizabeth McCracken's favorite story. Elizabeth, where are you?
Right there.
Right here. You've
Hi,
asked such.
Elizabeth.
Hi, Asali. Hi, Mia. Truthfully, this has been such an amazing conversation that like all of the questions have been asked better than I would ask them.
Well, Asali, what do you want to tell us that we haven't asked? What are you thinking about? What are you reading? What do you read for pleasure? Who are some of your kind of, with all the wonderful rich catalog of influences and pleasures that live in your books? Go.
Well, so I was going to say that the book I'm reading right now is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. And that book, one of the things I really like about it is that it's shamelessly plugging a lot of books. Like it's about a bookstore, and it just sounds like, and I'm like, oh, this could keep me in books for a long time, like these recommendations. So you know, I've really been enjoying that. And I am basically this, it's the part of the semester where I'm just basically reading books for class. And so right now there's a poetry collection called Black Movie by Dana Smith that's really great. It has a lot of poems about Lion King in it and that kind of thing. And Elizabeth McCracken's most recent collection of stories is quite good, although the title is fleeing my mind. Elizabeth, what's the title of your most recent collection of stories?
Souvenir Museum.
Yes, beautiful. That was really good. And so for people who like the star of the story, also check out the Souvenir Museum.
What's the name of the book of poetry with the Lion King poems?
Black Movie. Here, let me put it in the thing. Yeah, so that's the poet, Dana Smith. I'm teaching a course called The New Black Arts Movement, Expressive Culture After Nationalism. And it starts out in the late 70s, like the Black Arts Movement proper, and then moves into sort of contemporary stuff. So mainly I'm trying to keep catch up with that.
Other questions from the audience?
Can I take advantage of the organizer's prerogative? I'm sorry to, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but, and this is actually more of a, well, there is a question. So I'm curious about your continual exploration of Philadelphia as a setting for your work. And I know that you're from Philadelphia, you're living there now.
Mhm.
And I asked that question because I love Philly. And I should say I love Philly, and I grew up in Memphis, and I find a lot of connections between Memphis and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Both like really rich places, culturally, right? In terms of like landscape. And I think that Philadelphia and Memphis are both chronically underrated cities. And I think that with Philly, it's based on Philly's, position between New York City and DC. And for Memphis, I feel like that chronically underrated situation is because Memphis is between Nashville and Austin. Like those are the shinier cities on either side of this gritty post-industrial place. And so I would just love if you would talk more about how you found yourself continually returning to Philadelphia as the backdrop for your stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with me thinking about the way Edward P. Jones was treating Washington, D.C. and sort of writing about Washington, D.C. and these sort of kind of regular people and giving them sort of mythic dimensions. And I think also I spent 20 years living in other places, and it really allowed me to see the things about Philadelphia that were very particular. So Philadelphia is like, at this point, I mean, I think definitely demographics are shifting as they are in other big cities, but still a heavily Black city. And in that, there's so many different kinds of things going on. Even in so West Philadelphia, where I live, so many different kinds of things going on. So much. There's sort of conventional, there's working class, there's poverty, there's, wealthy people, there's Christians, there's so many Muslims, just like there's these just sort of like, and I grew up in sort of like among people who are kind of African nationalists, culturally speaking, and also were vegetarians. And, it's just like, I think that there's so much to write about here. That's also a way of writing about being Black in America and being Black in the world, and I can give it a kind of specificity based on my interaction with it. But I think that that's a lot of, it started out just as what I knew about and then wound up being something that I was really interested in. Oh,
Thank you. Muted. Oh yeah, you're muted.
Okay. Wait, you're still muted.
You're still muted.
So sorry. When I finished reading Days of Afrekete, I went back to read some of Audre Lorde's poetry, and I'm looking at the clock, but thinking about one of the things that I appreciated most about that narrator of yours is the love she has for all the characters, in spite of their messiness and complexity and confusion. And it made me go back to Between Ourselves, the poem. And I think it's the ethos that the Days of Afrekete leave us. And I just wanted to thank you for sharing your work with us, and thank you for the time, and to put Audre in a wonderful kind of tribute with your work. And this stanza in particular, I think, is what the genius of Days of Afrekete is all about. And it's the section of Between Ourselves that says, "Do not mistake my flesh for the enemy. Do not write my name in the dust before the shrine of the god of smallpox. For we are all children of Isu, god of chance and unpredictable, and we each wear many changes inside our skin." Your work was a pleasure to live with. And thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. And thank you, Professor Wilkes.
Thank you, Asali, Mia. Wow. Thank you to everyone who came today, who logged on for this enriching conversation. Take care. Asali, I hope to meet you in person one day. Mia and the rest of our UT Austin community, I look forward to seeing you in person again.
And thank you so much. I've never done this before. I was so nervous.
Oh, no, it was great. It was really good. Thank you.
Jennifer's the master, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I get to be in a room with Asali, and I'm a nervous wreck.
Oh my God.
This is a beautiful conversation. Thank you all, everyone. Take care, stay safe, and until next time. Bye.
My mom's here, Asali. My mom is up. She's Shirley Carter in the window. So,
hi, Mom. Hi, Mom. Hi,
mothers.